Here's one of our T600s, just off the road for air conditioning service. Hopefully it's only routine maintenance, but it could easily be a problem where the driver isn't comfortable because the cab is too hot or too cold. Well, in either case, the driver, our dealership, and Kenworth are all depending on us to maintain the highest quality standards as we troubleshoot and correct any problem. But our world just got more complicated. The R12 refrigerant that we're used to working with is one of the chemicals responsible for damage to the ozone layer. So it's being phased out and replaced with R134A. All of our latest Kenworths will be using the newly engineered R134A air conditioning systems. We'll be getting both types in for service, and we need to learn to tell the differences between the two systems. A lot of things will work differently on the R134A systems, and some things will be pretty much the same. But this changeover is a good time to not only learn the differences, but to review basic air conditioning service, so we can offer our customers the world's best service on the world's best truck. So let's get started. Kenworth's R134A training program has three important elements. This video and workbook combination both cover the major areas that you'll need to know about. A test will let you know which areas you're weak in and what you need to get up to speed on. And finally, the service manual contains step-by-step procedures for both troubleshooting and repair that'll help you once the course is completed. When you see this screen, it means it's time to pause the video and read the exercise in the workbook before going on. When you see this screen, stop the video and take the test that goes with that module. And feel free to rewind the tape and review any parts of the tape or reread the workbook before you take the test. All tests allow you to keep the maintenance manual open for reference. Now, some tests include practical questions that show you what you would actually see and hear if you were looking at the truck. Play the test question and then pause while you answer. When you're done, go on to the next question. And again, feel free to review the question as many times as you need to answer it. Well, let's start with an overview of air conditioning and where we fit in. Actually, climate control is a better way to think of it, because the heater system is part of what keeps the driver in a comfortable working environment. Now, unless this truck is in for regular service, it represents an unhappy customer. In the customer's mind, the problem is simple. They're either too hot or they're too cold. It's easy for them to say, but we're the ones who have to come up with a solution. And the solution requires an understanding of how heat is transferred in and out of the cab. So what is heat? Well, let's just say it's a lot of excited molecules. Let me explain. Molecules are tiny particles that make up every material, whether it's a solid, a liquid, or a gas. And the hotter these tiny molecules get, the more they move around. Something that's hot has molecules that are more excited than something that's cool. When a hot object meets a cool object, a lot of hot, excited molecules meet the cooler, less excited molecules, and they tend to split the difference. The hotter molecules transfer some of their excitement or heat to the cooler molecules, making them more excited. When this happens, we say that heat energy is transferred. Heat energy is always transferred from the hotter object to the cooler one. Anyone who's accidentally put their hand on a hot manifold knows that the hot manifold transfers heat to your hand. So, what does all this excitement have to do with how hot or cold the cab feels? Well, if the cab feels too cold, the driver transfers some hot, excited water molecules from the jacket water to the heater core, exciting or heating the molecules in the metal fins. And when the blower pulls the cool cab air across the metal fins, some of the excitement is transferred from the molecules in the fins to the air molecules, heating the cab air. This transfer of molecules idea sounds more complicated than it really is. The driver just moves the temperature control to warmer and turns on the blower. Or if the driver wants to transfer some of those hot, excited air molecules out of the cab, he turns the control to cooler and turns on the air conditioner. The R134A refrigerant in the air conditioning system acts like a conveyor belt for heat. It cools the fins on the evaporator so the hot, excited molecules from the cab air transfer their heat to the refrigerant. The refrigerant, which is now hot and excited, then moves the heat to the condenser, where it transfers the heat to the cool air flowing past the condenser fins. Here in the cab, the driver feels the cool air coming from the vent. And as an added bonus, the cooling of the cab air on the evaporator fins also condenses water from the air and lets it out of the cab through a drip tube. This reduces the humidity or the water content of the air, and it makes the driver feel even cooler. That's the big picture. The air conditioning system transfers heat from inside the cab to the outside air. But we'll need to know more than that to be able to diagnose a problem. So let's examine each of the parts of this system and see how they work. Let's start with the compressor. It's the heart of the system. The compressor moves the refrigerant through the system. It sucks the cool R134A vapor from the evaporator and compresses it into a hot, high-pressure vapor, discharging it to the condenser. The compressor is mounted in different places according to the engine model. A belt-driven electric clutch engages the compressor when the air conditioning system is on. The refrigerant is pumped from the compressor to the condenser. The condenser is like a radiator for refrigerant. The hot R134A vapor travels through the thin tubes and heat is transferred from the refrigerant to the fins. The cool ram air flowing past the fins transfers the heat to the air, cooling and condensing the R134A vapor into a liquid. The condenser is mounted in front of the charge air cooler. Next, the refrigerant reaches the receiver dryer. It's mounted on the radiator housing. The receiver dryer has three functions. First, it acts as a reservoir for the R134A, making sure there's always a supply to the expansion valve. Second, if we look inside, we can see that there's a filter system for removing contamination from the system. And third, the main ingredient in the filter is a desiccant. This is a material that absorbs water, drying the refrigerant. Water is the #1 enemy of an air conditioning system. The desiccant can absorb a certain amount, but when it becomes saturated, that is, when it can't absorb any more water, the water circulates to the expansion valve where it can freeze and plug the valve. A moisture indicator will turn from blue to white in the presence of moisture and to pink when the desiccant becomes saturated. And there's also a clear sight glass that lets you look to see if refrigerant is circulating through the system. From the receiver dryer, the R134A moves to the expansion valve. The expansion valve not only drops the pressure in the system, allowing the refrigerant to expand and cool, but it regulates the amount of R134A allowed into the evaporator, controlling the temperature. You'll find it mounted on the side of the main heater AC unit. It's on the passenger side firewall of the engine compartment. On one side of the valve is the high-pressure liquid R134A from the receiver dryer. On the other side, the suction side of the compressor has lowered the pressure on the evaporator. When the power head pushes the stem back, the valve opens, and the liquid refrigerant expands into the low pressure area where it cools. As the R134A leaves the evaporator, it passes through the top half of the valve where it warms or cools the gas-filled power head. The power head acts like a thermostat, expanding and contracting as it warms or cools. The power head is attached to the stem. If the refrigerant coming out of the evaporator is too cool, the gas in the power head contracts, allowing the spring to push the stem back, closing the valve. If the refrigerant coming out of the evaporator is too warm, the gas in the power head expands, pushing the stem against the spring and opening the valve and allowing more cooling. The expansion valve is usually attached to the evaporator. The evaporator is on the engine side of the firewall within the blower unit. Inside the evaporator, heat is transferred from the cab air to the refrigerant. As the liquid R134A passes through the expansion valve, it cools. As it passes through the evaporator, heat from the cab air is transferred through the fins to the refrigerant. As the liquid R134A heats up, it boils and evaporates, changing from a liquid to a vapor. This evaporation process traps the heat energy in the refrigerant. In addition to the power head of the expansion valve, there are 3 electrical control switches, including a freeze switch, also called a thermostatic switch. This one prevents ice from forming on the evaporator. The binary switch prevents system damage from high or low pressure, and a fan pressure switch activates the radiator fan to increase cooling of the condenser when the high side pressure increases past a set point. Engaging the electrical compressor clutch starts the air conditioning cycle. In order for it to engage, the freeze switch must be closed, telling the system that the evaporator is above freezing temperature. The selector switch is in either the bi-level, defrost, or AC position, and the blower switch must be on. Also, the pressure switches must be closed, showing that the system pressure is not out of limits. Now, let's take a look at all the components functioning as a unit. When the compressor clutch is engaged, warm, low-pressure vaporized R134A is pulled from the evaporator and compressed into a hot, high-pressure vapor. The hot vapor transfers heat to the ram air as it passes through the condenser. It cools and condenses back into a liquid. After filtration in the receiver dryer, the warm liquid R134A passes through the expansion valve where it becomes a cool, low-pressure liquid. As heat is transferred from the cab air, the refrigerant evaporates, trapping the heat energy. The warm vapor is then pulled into the compressor, where the cycle starts again. The area between the compressor outlet and the expansion valve is known as the high side or hot side of the system, while the area between the expansion valve and the compressor intake is known as the low side or cool side of the system. Well, now is a good time to pause the VCR and read the first section in your workbook. The text will help you remember what you've seen so far. When you've done reading, continue on with this module. So that's how it works. Now, why does it work? Or better yet, why should I care why it works? Well, if I don't know why it works, I have to take a cookbook approach to troubleshooting. There are many different symptoms that have to be considered when diagnosing an air conditioning problem. And if I don't really know the whys of what I'm observing, I can easily overlook something or be confused by situations where the symptoms are similar. On the other hand, if I understand the whys of the system, my job becomes easier. I can follow the troubleshooting steps without second-guessing my observations or becoming confused with seemingly conflicting information. So let's tackle the subject. Engineers take a few of nature's laws and apply them very cleverly to make air conditioning work. We already talked about one of them. Heat energy always travels from something that's hot to something that's cooler. So far, so good. Now here's the second trick. The relationship between when a liquid boils and the air pressure. Have you ever noticed in a cookbook that there are special instructions for baking a cake at high altitudes? Well, maybe you haven't, but there are. And it's because when you lower the pressure, you lower the boiling point. And the opposite is also true. When you raise the pressure, you raise the boiling point. This device shows that it's working. I've pumped this container down with a vacuum pump and boiled some water. Now, the thermometer only reads about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but the usual temperature for boiling water is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So reducing the pressure lowered the boiling point. This pressure cooker is not as popular as it used to be, but it does cook food faster because increasing the pressure raises the boiling point of water and allows more heat to be transferred to the food. In the air conditioning system, we do the same thing. On the low side of the expansion valve, the suction side of the compressor has reduced the pressure, so the R134A boils at a lower temperature. Over here, on the high side of the compressor, the pressure is increased, so the boiling point is raised. It's easy to remember. Pressure down, boiling point down. Pressure up, boiling point up. So why is the boiling point so important? Well, that brings us to the third trick. The amount of energy the refrigerant gains or loses as it changes state. Now, we're not talking about moving from New York to New Jersey. We're talking about when the R134A changes from a liquid to a vapor and back again. See, a vapor is one state or condition of matter, and liquid is another, and solid is a third. Again, here's a demonstration using water. At low temperatures, these water molecules are not too excited. They stick together and they stay in a specific shape and are contained in a specific volume, these pieces of ice. But if we add energy, heat, the water molecules get more excited and they change their state from ice to water, from a solid to a liquid. The molecules are so excited now they can't hold their shape, but they do fill a specific volume. And then, if we add even more energy, the water molecules get even more excited. And again, they change their state, going from liquid to vapor, from water to steam. And the vapor can't hold a shape or a volume either, but it will expand to fill a container, any container, even this room. That took some time. But here's the engineering trick. If you add heat to water, the temperature of the water slowly and evenly rises. And just as the boiling point is reached, the temperature stops rising, even though you're still adding heat. Then, when the liquid water changes state or turns to steam, the temperature of the steam starts rising evenly again as you add heat. What happens is that there is an extra amount of energy needed to make the water or any material change state. If we go backwards and take heat out of the steam, the temperature drops until it hits the boiling point, and then we have to take extra heat away to make the steam change to water. The fact that ice needs to absorb extra heat to change to water is why these ice cubes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit do a much better job of cooling my drink than a lump of metal at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I get extra cooling as the ice melts. That's trick number 3. Extra heat in or out is needed when a substance like R134A changes from liquid to vapor or from vapor to liquid. We can use that extra heat that it takes to change R134A from a liquid to a vapor to cool the cab air and store the heat while we transport it out of the cab. The final trick is a simple observation. When a gas or a vapor changes pressure or volume, it changes temperature. For example, this dry nitrogen is a gas under pressure in this small can. But when I release some, reducing the pressure and letting it expand, the temperature drops. You've all seen this happen. That's why you don't spray it on your hands. You get frostbite. That's trick number 4. For a closed system with a fixed volume, like our air conditioning system, when you drop the pressure, you drop the temperature. When you raise the pressure, you raise the temperature. Now let's look at how these 4 tricks all work together. At the expansion valve, the high-pressure R134A loses pressure rapidly and cools as it expands into the evaporator. That's why we call it the expansion valve. The lower pressure also reduces the boiling point. So when the heat is transferred from the warm cab air to the cool liquid R134A, the R134A boils and evaporates, changing state. That's why it's called the evaporator. The evaporation process, or change of state, absorbs extra heat that can't be released until the R134A changes state again. When the R134A vapor reaches the compressor, it is, you guessed it, compressed, raising the pressure. The cool vapor becomes a hot vapor, and the boiling point is raised because the pressure's increased. As the R134A vapor goes through the condenser, heat is transferred from the hot R134A to the cool outside air. Because the boiling point is now higher, the R134A easily changes state, releasing the extra heat it stored when it evaporated. The R134A condenses back into a liquid. And that's why we call this the condenser. Well, I hope nobody's head exploded with all that information. This is a good time to stop the tape, read the next section in the workbook, and then ask your instructor for the first test.